Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here. This is the fourth talk in our series at the UB Institute for Learning Sciences. We are very happy today to welcome Dr. Ari Hock, one of our UBILS postdocs. He comes to us from University of Washington in Seattle. And I will say two things about Ari. One is, fun fact, his name is a palindrome for his dad's name. And I gather his dad might actually be on Zoom right now. So if you're there, nice to see you, Mr. Hock. And then the other thing I wanted to say is Ari is an example of a learning scientist who does really interesting work that crosses what we might call research and outreach. Hold it a little closer. How's that? Now I feel quite imposing. Yeah, one thing that's really wonderful about Ari's work is that I think when we talk in the learning sciences about knowledge building, there's often an idea that, well, one way we do that is we go do science, and then in the other direction we might go and teach or write or do outreach. And Ari's work is a really beautiful example of when those two things are unified in a way that involves not just the field learning, but also the people that he is working with and his research participants learning. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ari Hock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and actually,
yeah, I guess I need that.
Oh, no, because you got your mic now?
I got my mic.
Okay, good.
Visions of Wallingford. All right, let's try it again together on three. 1, 2, 3. Visions of Wallingford. Woo! Okay. Thank you for humoring me. So as Dr. Hoadley said, my name's Ari, and I'm going to be talking to you today about my dissertation research that I did in Seattle called Visions of Wallingford, Neighborhood Learning Through Collaborative Filmmaking. And I want to start today by positing that we actually have, I think, different folks in this room kind of from different places professionally and otherwise. But I think most of us, whether we're learning scientists, other kinds of scholars, people interested in learning and education, all of us, I would say, really the most important thing we can be doing is thinking about how collectively we can learn to be in better relation with each other, with the planet that we're part of, the lands and waters that we occupy. And so whether your focus area or your main interest is sustainability, social justice, and equity, whether it's new literacies, whether it's human development, all of these things, in my view, kind of boil down to this in one way or another. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I also want to think about how that might show up across different scales. We can learn to be in better relation at a very small scale. So we could just think about all of us in this room right now, which is actually pretty incredible that all of you found your way over here to get some food and listen to me blabber on for a while. You know, it's kind of a pretty small scale. We could think about learning at the scale of maybe one organization, maybe a classroom, maybe a school, an after-school club. We can think about ourselves as people who live in a city or a country or citizens of this planet. And all of these scales are important. And so with the work that I'm about to share, this is focused on neighborhoods. What I'm not saying is that I think everyone should be focusing on neighborhoods or that everyone should be making a movie. I'm just showing this as one example, one piece in a puzzle that I think collectively we're all working towards. And I think this is one piece that sometimes gets overlooked a little bit. And I think that it could be somewhere where we might want to pay more attention. Because I don't know about you all, but it feels to me like at the national level right now, there's not a whole lot of progress that's happening. We're kind of at this gridlock. I think over the next 4 years, we're not going to see much of that change. On the other hand, when we look really small at maybe one classroom, I mean, a lot of people are doing really important work at that level. And sometimes it's not always clear how that might lead to larger social transformation. And so with this work, I'm thinking about learning at the scale of the neighborhood because I think that if we could do something really cool in one neighborhood, and that can catch on, and we can actually convene different neighborhoods. Now we're thinking at the scale of the city. And if we do something really interesting, really worthwhile at the scale of the city, that could catch on for other cities, countries, and then we're kind of cascading from there. So if there's one main takeaway that you have from this presentation, you got your food, you want to leave, that's fine. It would be that we can learn to be in better relation by moving together through the important places in our lives, listening to each other, and working together to figure out what kind of stories we should be telling about how we live together. So here's an overview of what I'm going to get into today. First, we're going to talk about what the heck is a Wallingford, for those of you who don't know. Then I'm going to be talking about the different methods that I had for collecting data and analyzing data in this study. Then we'll talk about some of the key concepts that I'm using to frame this work. After we do all that, we'll be in a good place to talk about the actual research questions guiding the study. And then we'll get into the exciting stuff, the findings. And I'll finish with some design principles that I hope will be useful to all of you. There will be some time to chat a bit, Q&A or more kind of like informal small group and maybe whole group discussion as well. So if you have any questions for me or you think of things that you want to talk about, just kind of make a note of them or jot them down, and we'll revisit that at the end. All right, what is a Wallingford? Does anyone know? I know someone knows. Wallingford is a neighborhood actually in Seattle, which is over there. This is in the yellow. This is the neighborhood in Seattle where I lived while I was doing my graduate studies. You can see it's pretty close to downtown. It's right along Lake Union. It's kind of within the isthmus of Seattle. You know, we've got this narrow strip of land. Wallingford is kind of centrally located. And Wallingford is a really awesome place, I think. We got some beautiful houses, some gardens. When I moved there, I was so blown away by how beautiful it was just going on walks in the neighborhood. And so it kind of has a feel of a small town in a big city, which a lot of people really like. And a lot of people kind of want it to stay that way. But the neighborhood is changing. And housing prices have really gone through the roof. The average housing price is over $1 million in Wallingford now. You can see some of the craftsman houses are being torn down, replaced, or they're just building higher density units and apartment buildings as well. And so kind of the sense of place in the neighborhood is changing along with that. It's actually a very different situation in some ways than what's happening in Buffalo. I know housing prices are also rising in Buffalo, but the city still owns a lot of land, whereas in Seattle, that's not necessarily the case. So it's a lot harder to find places to develop and do things in Seattle than it is in Buffalo right now. And really the main issue is that as the neighborhood's changing, residents want to be involved in those changes, but they don't necessarily see a pathway for what that looks like. And so you see things like this group of residents who is crowding in front of this house and saying, you know, we don't want any upzones or increases in zoning density where they're going to be tearing down our houses and building apartment buildings and creating more affordable housing in some instances. And you can see how much energy there is right here, right? And so some of you may think this energy is misplaced, but what I notice when I see this is like people really came together for something that they felt was important. And Wallingford, as you can see, is a predominantly white neighborhood. It's also, I think residents think of themselves as being fairly liberal. So you'll see things like, we don't want apartment buildings coming in, but we do think Black Lives Matter. So this is a real photo from the neighborhood. And so to me, this kind of represents an opportunity because you have people who have maybe share values about what equity or inclusion looks like, but don't necessarily know how they can be part of that solution as their neighborhood's changing. And so I hear conversations about this sort of thing from a planning perspective and a community governance perspective happening. But I don't hear a whole lot of conversations about this happening from a learning perspective, which is, I think, really badly needed and kind of missing from some of these conversations. And so, you know, what do residents need to learn in order to become meaningfully engaged as kind of their neighborhood is changing? And so I started thinking about these questions during the pandemic. And I started interviewing people in my neighborhood to kind of see what they were taking away and what was on their mind. And I have a background in documentary filmmaking, something that I love to do. And I was also doing my dissertation research, kind of getting started with it at this time. So I thought maybe I would study the filmmaking process as a site of learning and teaching, which leads to the methods. So there were several different phases of data collection for this project. And each phase had kind of different people involved in different ways. So there's a lot going on. And we're talking like over these different phases, there were hundreds of people who were involved in one way or another through this project. And I'm going to talk through each of these phases kind of one by one. So I started the project with some initial interviews with different community members. I tried to get a diversity of perspectives. And so I reached out to folks through social media. I approached different community organizations and see if I could get people through that. And the purpose of the interviews was to learn about these community members' experiences and histories in the neighborhood. And as part of the interviews, I actually gave them a crayon and some construction paper and had them draw maps with kind of the prompt, if you were going to lead a walking tour in your neighborhood, where would you take people and why? And so from these kind of hypothetical discussions, some people actually went on to lead walking tours of their neighborhood. And this became the basis for the documentary film. So there were 6 walking tours in total. All the tours kind of converged around different themes based on the participants or the tour leaders' interests. So one of the tours was focused on housing, but just one of the tours, actually, because I wanted to really expand the way that we're thinking about land use. Housing is maybe the most sexy issue that kind of came up, but really I feel like it's so closely interconnected with other things like the waterways in the neighborhood, like plants, like public art. And so I intentionally wanted to kind of have different tours focused on different things and have us kind of walk through the neighborhood together and talk about them. The tours were filmed. I helped film the tours along with a couple other community members. And those became the basis for the documentary film. I also wanted community members to be involved in assembling the film. So we have what's called this art team, the assembly review team, who were tasked with reviewing footage from the walking tours. So we met 3 times. During the first meeting, the art members reviewed footage of a tour and then shared it with the rest of the group. I asked them what footage should be included in the film, and then I took that feedback and went to my computer and edited the film, and then we met a few weeks later, and then I showed them a rough cut of the film. And then I asked them for feedback on that. Do we need any additional footage? What are we missing? And then I ran over and I was filming stuff, and I put some more stuff together. I also had help with a professional video editor, and then we had a fine cut of the movie, and then I had them review that. And that kind of was the process for how we made the movie. So then we had the film itself, and then we screened the film. And the screenings were really important because the purpose of the screenings wasn't just to show people the movie. It's not about whether you like the movie, you don't like the movie. It's about keeping the conversation going that started during the interviews and the walking tours and kind of going through this whole process. So this is an example of the main public screening where we had over 100 people attend. We had different organizations that were doing tabling, like the public library, like different nonprofits were there. And this was one screening. We had several screenings for different audiences. So we did a screening for the local high school where we had students get involved and kind of talk about what they saw. We had a screening for unhoused folks who were living in a tent encampment in the city, which is a really, really important venue, I thought, to show the film and kind of get their feedback as well. And then we ended, the final phase of data collection involved sort of like exit interviews with people who had been heavily involved with the project because I wanted to better understand what they were taking away from the process. So that's the different data that we had. There was a lot of video data from the tours and the art meetings. I was filming a lot of stuff. We had surveys. We had all like this huge corpus. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I analyzed it. I found my way into the data first by looking for moments of tension, because I was interested in seeing not just, it's called collaborative filmmaking, but I also wanted to see where were kind of the rifts and where were people seeing things differently. That's kind of where I started. I did an interaction analysis of moments during the walking tours and the art meetings that surfaced and seemed particularly interesting. And for those of you who don't know, this kind of interaction analysis involves viewing video clips, usually with a group of people. We all kind of notice things differently, and we talk about what came up. We're trying to basically understand how the participants in these interactions were making sense of what was happening. After I did that, I also did an analysis of the film itself because I wanted to better understand how this film as artifact, people might be interpreting it. And so I was looking for different meaning potentials that were in the different modes of the film. And by modes, I'm thinking about things like shot type, like music, like color, all of these different ways that a film can convey meaning I was looking at. And then I did a mediated discourse analysis across the entire corpus. So that involved trying to identify what discourses were relevant that I had pointed out during the interaction analysis, and then following those discourses as they transformed. I think someone on Zoom might want to press the mute button, or maybe Lindsay can do that. Looking at identifying the most important discourses and looking at how they transformed across the different phases of the project. That sounds a little jargony. I'm going to show you some examples in a minute that will hopefully clear some of that stuff up. And I think actually before we even do that, let's get into some of these concepts, because I'm seeing that's what people want. Yeah. Okay. So kind of the main idea here is thinking about civic learning. And when I'm talking about civic learning, I'm not just talking about learning in schools. I think in order to understand what civic learning looks like, we need to look expansively across different settings. Because if we want to think about how civic learning can become consequential, how it can actually lead to change and social transformation, we need to look across different contexts and institutions, really. So, big idea, civic learning is how modes of expression laminate into modes of relation. There's a lot there, so we're going to break that down. I'm going to start with this idea of lamination, and which is how different expressions get layered across multiple interactions and over time as we develop different ways of understanding each other and working together. And so just keep that kind of in the back of your mind. I'm going to break down each of these pieces individually, and then we'll come back to the whole thing. So modes of expression. There are many ways that we express ourselves. In this project, I was focused on 3: talking, listening, and moving. One way to think about this kind of more holistically is modes of expression are repertoires of meaningful actions which are located in individuals' bodies. Okay, so there are all sorts of ways we can express ourselves. Talking, I thought, was really important. I mean, it's maybe the most obvious mode of expression. It's what I'm doing right now to express myself. But I also wanted to highlight listening as a mode of expression in its own right, because the way you all are listening to me right now affects the interaction that we're having. If you're nodding, if you're looking down, if you're eating something, if you're staring at me, I mean, that's going to totally change kind of the meaning making that's happening in our interaction. So I wanted to lift that up and see how that was showing up or not in the data. And then moving, I mean, this whole project was kind of centered around walking tours where we're moving through the neighborhood. So I wanted to see how that movement might play a role in participants' sense making. So if modes of expression are more individual, modes of relation are more collective. You can think of modes of relation like ways of being together. Just like pretty basically, there are many ways that we can be in relation with each other. And this project is focused on 2: place storying and infrastructuring. So place storying is ecologically coordinating attention in order to tell stories with and about the important places in our lives. And so there's this kind of really close connection between place and story, where it's almost like in order to experience a place, we're telling a story, we're living a story about it. If folks have learned about narrative inquiry, I'm kind of drawing on some of that here. And then infrastructuring is another mode of relation that I was interested in this project, is it wasn't just about the storytelling aspect, but it's also kind of, there's a design element too. And so I'm thinking about infrastructuring as redesigning components, relations, or routines in order to support some kind of joint work. So when we see infrastructuring, maybe depending on our disciplinary background, we think about different things. We think about physical infrastructure like roads and houses and bridges. We might think about social or civic infrastructure. All of these, I think, are kind of related. We're going to explore this in one of these examples here. So going back, modes of civic learning is how modes of expression laminate into modes of relation. So the idea is that as we move through our neighborhood together, we're reviewing footage of these tours, we're seeing what themes come up, we're starting to, our expressions are starting to laminate into new ways of being together. And so right now, I think this is a good way of describing civic learning, but it's kind of focused on local interactions. And I wanted to think also about how local interactions are related to broader cultural discourses, or what I'm calling civic semiotics. And so this kind of acknowledges that, that there's sort of a cultural dimension to what's happening in interactions. So discourses can actually inform modes of expression. And the ways that we relate to each other can actually structure our discourses too. So when I'm talking about discourses, I'm talking about culturally resonant conversations that might come up in the media or in social life. These are things that you talk about, you have an opinion about, you kind of are familiar with these conversations. Maybe things like housing or homelessness could be examples of conversations, but there are all these different things that we might consider a conversation. Social languages are personas that we might take up or embody as we engage in these conversations. And so together, these two ideas of conversation and social languages are kind of what I'm thinking about as discourses. So with that, research questions, which I know you're all waiting for. Number one, what discourses emerge over the course of a collaborative filmmaking project in a densifying, predominantly white Seattle neighborhood? How do inhabitants express these discourses during the walking tours, the assembly review team meetings, within the film itself, and in response to viewing the film? And then third, how and to what extent are these expressions laminated into new modes of relation over the course of this project? So we're going to kind of take a look at, oh yeah, and then this is how the elements of the conceptual framework directly map onto the research questions, just to hopefully make things a little clearer. All right, findings. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go through two examples, each one detailing how a particular discourse emerges and transforms over the course of interactions through this project. So we're actually going to watch a video of each. These are like 3-minute videos. So I'll ask us all to kind of watch the video together. I'm actually going to ask you all to first give your interpretation of what you're seeing happening in the video clip. And then I'll kind of show my analysis. So as you're watching, try to consider what discourses show up, or if that concept still feels a little slippery. Just think about what do you think is kind of the main idea that is being talked about or enacted in these clips. And this first example is from one walking tour, which was focused on housing. All right. So keep in mind, I spent a lot more time looking at this data than you did. But does anyone want to just bravely suggest one thing that you noticed from watching the video? Yes. Hmm. People are preoccupied with particular issues.
Opinion of theirs. Uh, that's something I noticed with the parking woman.
Yeah, yep. So Rick was bringing in data and Edith was just
Yeah,
didn't
she
really
was
care.
like, sure, but there is my opinion and I will not give it up. Which is a lot of like environmental issues. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Samir.
Was pleasantly surprised by how long.
Just so that people on Zoom can hear.
Thanks for your talk. One thing that I was pleasantly surprised by was that the conversation kind of continued because, I mean, within the first 30 seconds or so, there could have been a really easy impasse where they just ignored each other for the rest of the walking tour. And I thought it was kind of encouraging that even though they had disagreements and maybe didn't necessarily align on their interpretations of existing data, they still found a way to sort of like coexist collaboratively on the walking tour and small shift, but shift their opinions a little bit and find like, okay, well, maybe we can charge for some of these parking spaces. I thought that was nice.
Terrific. Thank you. Can we get maybe one more?
I mean, it was super different than public engagement events I've been to in my city. People like they all sounded like urban planning experts.
Thank you. Yeah, some of that may have. Well, I mean, I think it goes to show the people who show up for this sort of thing, because I tried to advertise it widely. People who actually showed up for the tour had kind of some background, it seemed like. Yeah. So the main conversation that I noticed in this clip was about accessibility and building an accessible community. So I'll kind of walk through my analysis of it and see if it resonates with you all. So Kelly over here is the tour leader. So she starts this clip by taking people to a particular location. So she stops the group and points to this mixed use building. And she points to this building which has residences in the second floor, and kind of on the ground floor, it's got some local businesses. She points to this building as an example of how building density and diversity is really important for small businesses to be able to financially access the storefronts in the neighborhood. Otherwise, you just get things like chains. And there's a little bit of a back and forth about that. I think Rick mentioned something about parking data. And then later on, as the tour group starts to move, Kelly actually stays behind. She tells the group where to go, but the group is kind of free to move along themselves. And so what this does is it opens up space for Greg to approach Rick and ask him to follow up on the parking data that he mentioned, kind of informally when the camera's not pointing at his face, although, there's still a boom mic behind him. But and so this is interesting to me because Greg actually is more of an advocate for automobile access, I would say. And Rick obviously is an advocate for pedestrian access. But in this moment, Greg positions Rick as a teacher or someone with knowledge that he wants to learn from. So he's asking him to tell him more about this parking data. And then they walk down the street. And throughout this walk, Rick kind of explains about the shared street network in New Zealand. And that keeps going until they come out to a crossroads. And they make this physical left turn on the road. And when that happens, it actually opens up space for the conversation to take a left turn discursively as Edith gets involved. And she had just been kind of walking aside from them, not really saying much. But now she comes in and she's like, okay, let's talk about how important parking is, or automobile access. And so the two kind of go back and forth for a while. Greg actually leaves the conversation. Danny enters the conversation and then leaves it again. So there's this sort of a fluid participation pattern. And then that keeps going on until eventually Greg kind of, at least temporarily, convinces Edith that maybe we shouldn't be publicly subsidizing all of this parking in the city, which maybe Edith didn't even know was happening. But in this moment, as the duo physically aligns with the rest of the group at the next tour stop, they discursively align where they're thinking like, okay, maybe we should be thinking about accessibility in a bit more of a nuanced way. So this is kind of an overview where Kelly stops the group to point to this building, which is outlined in yellow. They start moving again, they take a turn, and they align at the next tour stop. So you can see they've only really walked a couple blocks, but during that time, they've gone on quite a journey. This example was, and this is an example of infrastructuring, because you've got these different individual participants. But I didn't mention this, but they all happen to be involved with different community organizations, which is something that Chris noticed. Like they all have some kind of expertise in some of this stuff, and they're from different organizations. This is the first time that they all physically came together to walk through their neighborhood. So we're convening the social or civic infrastructure of the neighborhood as they're reimagining what the physical infrastructure could look like. This example was pretty focused on the built environment, and it looks at just one, what Ananda Marin calls an ambulatory sequence, where they're moving over the course of one interaction. Now we're going to take a look at a different example that's more focused on the natural world and takes place over the course of two project phases. So it starts with a clip that shows a walking tour focused on plants, and then the video clip is going to immediately go to show two different art meetings. The first one where they reviewed, they're actually going to review footage of that tour, of the plant tour. And then it's going to go to the second art meeting where they kind of reconvene. So once again, I'll ask you to watch a video clip. It's about 3 minutes long. And then I'll see if you have any thoughts that you want to share about it. All right. What did we notice?
Like there was kind of the obvious like point of tension between the two people who like were considering who should have access to the tree and like the fruits that the tree was bearing. Like someone who kind of saw the joy of the children like running up to the tree and just taking like 2 or 3 cherries, and then kind of like the other person being like, well, that's my cherry tree, like and my cherries. Yeah, so definitely, I don't know. Oh, sorry. No, I was just gonna like say like kind of like thinking about like when things are in public, like are they in public for other people to enjoy, or are they in public for other people to like be thankful towards like the person who put it there?
Thank you, Stacey. Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how transition to like this first scene of like the kids like being happy and then getting like the cherries. And at first like you don't think, oh, like they're taking from somebody's tree. And then next scene it goes to, she's explaining how she feels about for 14 years people taking her property. But I think it was really good how they were like, or y'all were sitting in a circle, and it wasn't like it was a situation that had tension, but it wasn't like hostile, and they were both able to like explain their point of view. And I like how lady was like, I have a fig tree too. You're welcome to come and pick it. And then the final scene was like them all sharing like food or dessert or whatever it was from the tree. And then like they were like in a um like really nice environment, sharing, laughing and talking and sharing memories. And then I like the one comment that the lady made pointed out was like, are you sharing? Like kind of like pointing out how like before she was kind of like, oh, this is mine, and now it's like it's all of us now that we're in this space after she's had this time to like express her grievances and things like that. She feels more comfortable to share that with others. So I thought that was really interesting. I never thought about that at all.
Thank you, Holiday. Yeah. One more person? What's the sharing?
Big point.
Yeah.
One thing that sort of struck me is, you know, as somebody who doesn't know a lot about like tree law, it seems like, oh, if it's in a traffic circle, it's probably fair game because it's not identifiably belonging to somebody. And then the conversation about what's in the areas by the sidewalks about whether that belongs to somebody or not. And it made me think about how when people spend a lot of time in a place, they feel a sense of ownership over that place.
Mhm.
And that sense of ownership may or may not be shared. So like, you know, I would wager most people wouldn't begrudge some young kids picking some cherries off a tree in a traffic circle. But maybe if those young kids came from a different neighborhood, or if you know, it was a homeless person,
Mhm.
then there might be different attitudes about who's entitled to belong to the space. And you know, the kids and the nature, they don't care about these boundaries, but the adults, that's kind of an important thing for them. So that struck me as a possible set of other conversations that might
Oh,
be
yeah.
had.
Yeah. Well, you all are doing my job for me, so I'll just I think I'm going to hit on a lot of the same points that you already shared. I will say I was thinking about this through the lens of care and specifically cultivating community care. And I'll kind of walk through that. So it starts with footage from this plant tour, which was actually led by this girl, Luna. This is her mom. And her mom kind of starts the scene by being like, check out this cherry tree, go get some cherries. Kids are all running over, they're picking cherries, they're sharing cherries with each other, they're eating cherries. The parents are listening for cars to try to keep them safe. And so you could say the plant tour group is embodying community care at the cherry tree. One clip that I didn't show as part of this, but later on during the same tour, they have a conversation where they're talking more about kind of what care looks like in their neighborhood. And the cherry tree comes back up. And they're specifically referring to their shared experience at the cherry tree earlier. So that kind of signaled to me that this was an experience that they had together, that they started to imbue the cherry tree itself with this meaning around community care. Then, as some of you pointed out, during the first art meeting, Barb kind of blows that out of the water. One piece that's relevant is Barb is actually a longtime volunteer caretaker of fruit trees in the neighborhood. And sort of a coincidence, you say 50% coincidence, that she ended up reviewing this plant tour. And so she had some things to say about this clip, which I didn't anticipate ahead of time. But in retrospect, like, of course, she's got to have certain feelings about it. So she says, I don't know if she's even necessarily upset that the kids were picking cherries, but she's upset that not once did the adults mention that maybe we should ask for permission, or even that there might be humans involved that were taking care of this tree in the first place. Instead, they're just like, yeah, pick some fruit. And so then Tara comes in kind of with the perspective that it sounded like maybe Chris was talking about, just like, this is in a public right of way. Like, we should all be able to pick whatever fruit we want. And so the two kind of brush up against each other a little bit. And it starts to heat up a little bit. They're not getting violent or anything, right? This is a very civil conversation, to Holiday's point. But there still is a bit of tension in the room. And this conversation takes place over the course of several minutes. I spared you the details with this. But they have some strong feelings about it. And then during the second art meeting, just out of nowhere, I mean, Barb and Taro had brought food, I think, to the first meeting. But this time, Barb actually brings a cherry pie that she made with cherries that she harvested locally. And I'm not claiming that Barb did this on purpose, thinking about this past conversation they had, but this was a few weeks later, and she made this pie, and in a way, she's materializing community care for some of the reasons that Holiday shared. They're all eating together. They're enjoying this time. This was something I didn't plan was happening. I just had the cameras rolling, and I was like, hold on, let me go back and take a look at this. And what I found really interesting is that them eating this pie and kind of having this break here opened up this opportunity for Tara and Barb to revisit this conversation about community care that they had started earlier on. And really, I would say started with the walking tour, where they were moving through the neighborhood by the cherry tree. And during this conversation, Barb is able to make her care labor visible in a very material way. And Tara is inviting her to share more about it. She's asking her about her experience. Oh, how did you get the cherries from the fruit tree? Oh, she's acknowledging that she's sharing the fruit. And so they're starting to work towards what I might think of as partially overlapping ideals of community care and creating space in order to build on that based on this interaction. So to recap, we got the walking tour where they embody community care. We've got the first art meeting where they contest what community care means. And then the third segment here, they actually materialize community care. I would call this an example of place storying because individual stories and experiences are coming together as this group across different project phases is all collectively working to tell a story about their neighborhood. And notably, the cherry tree plays a really important role in that process. And so you could sort of see how the natural world is kind of entering into this conversation about what care looks like in their neighborhood. So to revisit the research questions, what discourses emerged over the course of the project? There were many. Here I pointed out two: care and accessibility, and a variety of social languages that they took up while talking about that. How do inhabitants express these discourses? We saw how physical and social positioning kind of played off each other during the first example about accessibility. And then during that second example, we saw how care was embodied and contested and materialized. And then how are these expressions laminated into new modes of relation? Well, we had the example about infrastructuring, where different institutional stakeholders are getting together to redesign the physical infrastructure in their neighborhood. And then we saw place storying happen as the cherry tree physically grounded these kind of abstract discourses about community care. So with that, I want to introduce some design principles. I hope these are useful to all of you, regardless of whether you're learning scientists, you're planners, You work on more of the administration side of things. You really anyone who's looking to galvanize community support around some kind of creative project, creative collaboration, and so that we can learn to be in better relation with each other and with the lands and waters that we call home. First design principle is to connect institutions. So you can use projects like this as a catalyst to connect institutions who are working in different disciplines or across different sectors. People were really excited, for the most part, that we're making a movie. And just like the fact that we had this shared project we were working on, I was able to get people who otherwise never were in a room together or walking around together. And so we had all sorts of different folks, from government officials, people from the planning commission were involved, local politicians. We had tribal members who were involved, people who were housed, unhoused, across different age groups, all coming together to work on this project. Working at the institutional level is really important because if you work on the individual level, then the project can kind of live or die by those individuals. But if you're connecting institutions, then this sort of project can become part of broader conversations and the ongoing work that a lot of these organizations are already doing. Number two, embrace the core tension. So if connecting institutions is maybe thinking collaboratively, embracing the core tension is about, thinking about the conflicts that show up. Because really that's where the most important things are, is where do we see things differently and how do we work past that? And so a project like this might not be able to solve a core tension, like, for example, like the crazy housing crisis in Seattle that's leaving people literally living outside. I don't claim this project is going to solve that, but the process of trying to articulate this core tension and working to resolve it can be meaningful in and of itself. Number three, keep it moving. And hey, I love being still. I love taking naps and stuff. But within education context, within planning context, there's this kind of a sedentary bias where we tend to be sitting down or in classrooms or on Zoom meetings, whatever. So whenever you can, why not think about how movement might enter into this sort of project, whether it's inside, whether it's outside. We saw how movement kind of encourages these dynamic participation frameworks and makes it easier for people to insert themselves in places where they feel more comfortable. Number four, show your work. So this is about both honoring the labor that different people put into the project and giving credit where credit's due. It's also about taking responsibility for the process of creating whatever it is you make. I never claim that the movie that we made is a perfect movie. I don't even claim it's a good movie. But if anything, I want to be as transparent as possible so people can see how we made it. And if there's some critiques to that process, great. That's part of the ongoing conversation. I had a film screening recently for this at a festival in Seattle where I invited one of the biggest critics of the project who put me on blast publicly and said this project is not doing X, Y, Z. I invited her to be one of the two people who was talking about the project during this film screening because I couldn't make it because I'm here in Buffalo. So I think like this is all part of the conversation and we're all kind of learning together. Number five is to implicate the audience. So, and I cannot stress this enough, I didn't make the movie so people can watch the movie and be like, that was a good movie. We want people who are watching whatever it is you're making, whether that's a film or a podcast or a map or whatever, we want them to be actively involved. We want to implicate the audience as characters in this emerging place story. So they can start to think about how they're inherently involved in this ongoing conversation and their role doesn't just end with being a viewer. So with that, I want to say thank you for letting me chat about my research for a little while. And thank you all for expressing yourselves during this presentation. And yeah. And I want to implicate you as audience members in one last discussion before we call it a day. So if you have questions for me, I'm happy to take them. But I think what we want to do now is maybe start with a turn in chat. How much time do we have actually? Okay, we got just a couple minutes. Let's just do like maybe 2 minutes, turn to the person next to you, and you can answer these questions or just chat about whatever came up to you that seems relevant during this presentation.
So, okay, I don't know. Yeah, I've so many interactions on Explore. About your favorite conversation. Oh man, I what I think it would be interesting to hear about like what you would say needs done here, especially with like stuff that work growing neighborhood, especially with like international students for work. How would they otherwise? I know there's like racial tensions here and also like cultural tensions. So I wonder how that would like how the community is responding to actually see like what's going on instead of, because I feel like everyone's in that bubble and it's like us versus
But maybe kind of like the power of a project like this to break those silos.
exactly, and actually like walking around. Yeah, I wonder about because I know I've heard like whenever I mention certain places, like reaction, I'd be like, oh, okay, it's like a certain type of like place you need to avoid or like, oh, that's like imagery or something like that. So it's like I think everyone is okay, like explored all the different areas and actually took the time to compare. I wonder. I think that's how like just like separate. I don't know exactly the like infrastructure, but I think it's definitely separated easily. Online spaces, like what? Really spaces. And definitely think about how I want to design because I want to incorporate more like concert projects.
Yeah, here.
Science class.
Oh yeah.
So this even like more like
Icon. That's audience settings. Adjust the speaker volume.
Okay, you don't know what you're saying.
I'm reading.
I know. Okay, thank you.
I think we lost the sound.
No, it's because it's focused on these people now. There's no microphone in front of these people.
Okay, I think we're gonna bring it back just for 1 minute. Don't want to break up awesome conversations they're having, but hopefully there will be some chance for you all to talk more afterwards. So if you can hear me, clap 1 time. You can hear me, clap 2 times. You can hear me, clap 3 times. You can hear me, clap 4 times. Okay, I hate to break up these awesome conversations, but we just have 1 minute left. If people want to stay, you're more than welcome to hang out as long as you want. But I just want to see if there's maybe one person who wants to share something from their conversation. Yeah, we got 1, 2 right here. Oh yeah, let's do over here first.
I'm first. Okay, I'm first. No, I think both those videos. I think one of the things Saguna and I were talking about was that, I think the biggest issues that we cannot overcome is the issue of like what happens when there's conflict in any community planning. I think there's a rush to feel good. There's not a rush to sort of sit with uncomfortableness for long periods of time to see what might be the outcome. So decision making is always based on not what's best for the community. It's based on how do we feel good about ourselves, and that's a problem. And you can see that very clearly.
Yeah. Thanks, Samir.
So one thing that we mentioned was how this kind of project is going to inherently bias towards certain types of people participating. And I see that in the activism things that I go to these days. One of the main questions we were grappling with last night at the Delavan Greater Community Center was that huge swaths of the population don't want to be a part of our thing. They don't care about this. They don't want us to be testing their soil for lead levels. They don't want that information to be public, right? And so, of course, everyone who showed up is great and engaged in solving problems, but there's so many people that we can't reach, and how do you build a project that includes people who wouldn't want to be a part of that conversation?
Excellent question. Yeah, go ahead.
And I'll kind of jump onto that. We have a good section going over here. It just makes me think a lot about that of like, if it's for the community, what community is it? Who deserves to be part of that community? Where do we draw those lines? And kind of seeing that like that social empathy take part throughout it, of then like blurring those lines a little bit of like, okay, then this is more part of our community. But is it for cars? Is it for people? Is it for people who want to eat the fruit or people who tend to the fruit? So it was kind of interesting to see that across the whole thing, which just I think resonates with everybody's work of like who is deserving to be at the table, who deserves to be part of this, and like what are we doing to blur the lines and like be more accepting of it.
That's beautiful. Okay.
I'm just going to chime in because that brought up some things. I think like when we talk about like people not wanting to do these things, we also have to think about like who's actually like getting paid and compensated to go and do these things. Cause like the people who are living in these like, you know, high lead areas, like you're not going to pay them probably, right? They're not like really benefiting like directly from it. Whereas like a lot of organizations get this like feel good, like, you know, thing from like, oh, I went and helped these poor people who are like living in this area. Whereas like, I think it's like important to frame like it's not that people don't want to be helped, but like we can't just go in and act like we know what's good for them, and therefore they should be grateful for that. So, sorry.
That's beautiful. That's great. Anyone else? Yeah.
Maybe one quick thing is it's so interesting because I've never been to Wallingford, Seattle, but it seems like there's a lot of overlapping concerns, you know, like the kinds of things that they were talking about, transportation, accessibility, a car culture or a pedestrian culture, you know, who's managing public space and who has access to, you know, reaping the benefits of it. We're having those conversations in Buffalo and probably in cities all over the country and the world. So that's nice to see that everyone sort of is rooted in these same questions.
Yeah. Well, I think we're over time. I just want to be respectful of your all time. Otherwise, I will be here for a little longer if people want to stay and chat. But thanks for being here.